English translation. 840th contact Friday, the 31st of March, 2023, 1:27, HRS.
Ah, I see there are two of you, and that you are no longer wearing a translation device. Greetings, Florena, and you, my friend. Your name is not familiar to me at the moment. Since I had the stroke, I am afraid I have had a hard time with names.
My name Neefos is what I'm called, and it is understandable to me that you cannot pronounce it already. Greetings, though.
You have learnt some things quickly. I mean regarding German. It reminds me that I also learnt languages quickly, but forgot them just as quickly.
Greetings also to you, dear father friend. Today I am accompanying Neefos, for he is not yet so proficient in German that he can communicate with you flawlessly.
That is not a problem, because I will simply formulate correctly when recalling and writing down the conversation.
Yes, that is certainly good, and about the languages I was told that by Ptah. But with me personally, learning the language quickly has another reason, which is based on the fact that we Plejarans have the possibility of.
Excuse me, but I know that. But you come here quite early. What is it that you have to report at such an early hour? Also, I have some questions here that should be passed on to the Grimium Plejarans Committee Board, which I should have answers to quickly again.
I will gladly do that, but I come here because I have the following to bring to you, which relates to the renewals that are coming up regarding...
This is indeed necessary because my time...
We know that from Ptah, so everything shall also be settled.
Then I will begin with the remarks that...
One moment, because I want to put everything immediately in the computer in place where the itemizations belong. One moment, please. Yes, here now you just have to tell me in which articles of the statutes, what is to be written. That is the easiest thing to do, if I insert what is supposed to be in the corresponding article.
You can handle it thus, that is good. Then I want to start and address the following first.
The whole thing took 1.5 hours. But now, if you will allow me, I would like to show you something I wrote 2 years ago, but which has now fallen into my hands again, and which I have spruced up in a few places, but which is also up to date today.
If you want to, I would love to.
Huh?
Here, this is it.
Whatever happens in the world.
Calling all those who really want peace. FIGU. Core group members and FIGU passive members. FIGU. Friends and like-minded FIGU members remain permanently neutral in what is your opinion, what you say, represent, and otherwise express. Do not politicize when you put forward your opinion, but say in a neutral wise what is right and what is wrong, but do not be in the form of a personal for or against concerning a thing or an event, etc., to be thought or done, but be neutral in expressing yourself, for it is wrong to take the side of one or the other, for only what is right or wrong can and must ever be said, and this regardless of whether it is a matter of thought or deed, for that makes no relevant difference to quarrel and argue about.
Evidence and attacks.
Why do you adversaries, critics, know-it-alls, and complainers cry out for proof, overlooking the truth and your own inadequacy, your ignorance and lowly intelligence and dim-wittedness? Why do you rise up in enmity against the truth and wander about with attacks in a world of all that is evil and negative, making yourselves greater in delusion than you really are? Why, antagonists, are you troublemakers, know-it-alls, and dumb critics? Why do you indulge in enmity against effective truth? Why do you defile ethics and morals? You adversaries as well as know-it-alls, complainers and antagonists who only indulge in lies as well as deceit. When you see yourselves so greater than you really are, let yourselves be lifted to the level of the normal and honest, for this is the way that never produces anger and enmity, but peace, friendship, love, as well as harmony. These values alone grant life.
The 6th of March, 2022, 1913 HRS, Billy.
I will assess that as very good indeed. However, what you said earlier, it all takes so long to be done. But if you allow, I still have something to ask personally.
With what Neefos says, I agree.
Of course, you do not have to constrain yourself, Neefos, so just ask.
Thank you. How do you personally feel about the war that is currently being waged?
You mean the Ukraine war, I take it?
Yes, I am referring to that.
I see it as sheer idiocy, as war always is and contradicts all logic, reason, and rationality, as it effectively always is with regard to every war. Every war also contradicts all ethics and morals, as I have been instructed by the committee to write a paper on, which I am currently working on. However, as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, it was probably started by Putin, the president of Russia, but America, in its delusion of hegemony, has done everything to ensure that it has come to such a pass that Putin has gone berserk. However, this also shows that he is no better than the American leaders, because the hostility comes from both sides. Basically, the blame for the whole thing is that America wants to make a pig out of Russia, ultimately with the help of NATO, which is what America is hoping for. This murderous organization, which is called the world's protecting power, is supposed to protect its member states. In reality, however, it is an international army of murderers, made up of military officers, adventurers, and professional murderers from various countries. This NATO was founded by America in 1949, with the then U.S. President Harry S. Truman as the originator of the idea. As Sfath found out at the time when he was present at the founding, without being noticed, of course, was that it was all for the purpose of gradually securing world domination for America. Truman's idea, according to Sfath's statement, was, as it had also been openly revealed at the founding, but then put down in writing in a completely different and falsified form, as well as the whole thing being concealed from the public and the world, that by founding NATO with this murderous organization, in time America was to dominate the countries of the world under the guise of creating security and war security assistance in wars. The world domination, which had been aspired to for a long time, was to be realized in the course of time, whereby it was decided that the countries of the world should gradually be secretly harassed, but also as a result of manipulation by rulers, who were and who continue to be of a mind to create enmity with neighboring countries and between their own people, and thus to cause states of war, for which reason the murderous organization NATO could then be called in to help or simply invade the country in a warlike, security-creating manner. For this reason, it was also decided to form and fraudulently expand NATO, so this was pushed through and happened, as a result of which 30 countries have so far joined America's now world-conquering murderous organization as NATO members, with all the various dumb, lowly, intelligent rulers of the world still not having grasped what game is actually being played with regard to NATO. This is what Sfath explained to me, and he certainly did not lie to me because he was the most honorable man I have ever met in my life so far. NATO is, contrary to all claims to the contrary, under America's secret patronage, and is also, in truth, nothing other than truly a worldwide, legitimized multi-genocidal organization to which 30 countries currently belong, but which Finland and Sweden also want to join. In the 1990s, a treaty was agreed and signed that there would be no NATO expansion eastwards across the German border, which was promised to Russia on high. Shortly afterwards, however, America and NATO broke this treaty and expanded further eastwards country by country, cutting Russia off from the west. Now Ukraine was to be added to this, which Russia of course resisted, and that is why it finally started the war. Thus began the idiotic war, which has now lasted for over a year, with further idiots from various foreign states supplying weapons of all kinds to Ukraine, whereby the whole thing goes on, and Zelensky, the name of the war-addicted leader of Ukraine, is able to continue this war. Both sides, Ukraine and Russia, are committing many monstrous war crimes, but the Ukrainians are worse, because they simply murder their own military if they are pro-Russian, just as they not only rape the country's own women, but then shoot them in order to blame these outrages on the Russians, as I myself have seen, together with Bermuda. War is simply dirty, mean, and criminal, with the military being nothing but murderers, and that too when they call the whole of a war national defense. Killing is always murder, one way or the other, and no matter what it is called, be it capital punishment or self-defense in war and the like. But what I want to say is that in various armies, not all the top brass in the military agree with the military leadership and the national government on everything that is done and dealt with, and that is usually just intelligence, political or partisan machinations. This is proven, for example, with this article that was leaked to me, as well as this one. If you, Florena, might want to copy this one, which you can read later in its entirety, so I have to read it out or explain it in bits and pieces now.
Yes, your idea is good, and I think Neefos is also okay with it.
I can agree with that.
Good. Then listen to what I'm reading from these articles. This is actually, by and large, the main thing that is all written here. The articles are attached to the contact report. I guess that is all there is to it.
That will also suffice, but I want to read these articles straight away.
Good. Then I have the following, which actually belongs to the whole, just for example why wars are started. In addition, via Bermuda and Ptah, I was commissioned by the board to write something about why the Earth humans disregard ethics and morals in such a wise that there is constant discord between the peoples, and everything else goes so wrong ethically and morally. Unfortunately, our earthly science of psychology, which should actually work on ethics and morals and teach the Earthlings in this respect, is more than just lowly intelligent and dumb, because what this really is and contains, it does not know. For this reason, the majority of human beings is also ethically and morally uneducated, and tolerates the military, and thus its mass murder in war, etc., as well as torture and the death penalty. Of the whole of ethics and morality, which should actually constitute the human being as a true human being, only a few % of the effective ethical moral values are known to psychology. That is why, with very few exceptions, the human beings of Earth immediately freak out when a louse crawls over their liver.
What are you saying? What you said I do not understand.
Simply that the human being immediately reacts out of himself or herself with hatred, anger or revenge, slander, lies and deceit, suicide, persecution, enmity, murder and manslaughter, and in the worst case with war, when something is said that is contrary to his or her view or opinion, or pointed out to him or her what they have done wrong, or have handled contrary to what is correct. This, however, is ethically and morally completely wrong, and does not correspond to what the true and very comprehensive values of ethics and morals contain, the totality of which are in fact much more than what psychology proclaims and has no idea of what ethics and morals really are. Consequently, they cannot psychologically explain the full and comprehensive values either.
I do not understand that.
If you have learned the German Sprache language? Better. Then it is certainly good for you to read what I have in works and writing regarding ethics and morals, which the clever ones of psychology separate from each other, and think that they have eaten wisdom with shovel diggers with that, and their stupid and insufficient explanations.
Ptah already spoke of the fact that Earth scientists obviously fancy themselves more knowledgeable than they really are, and in many cases they only call their theories knowledge.
That can certainly be said. Besides, they do not allow themselves to be taught, and are of the opinion that they are demigods or gods. They usually are addicted believers anyway, and in their delusion, they put themselves on the same chair as their imaginary god. But this is the same with intelligent ones, because the majority of the earthly humanity is afflicted with delusions of godliness, as is probably also the case with that idiot. There is no other way to put it, who is not even letting his name and email address be given, but makes stupid comments on the internet because I said something to Bermuda about the drone that was circling around our house and watching Mark and Heartmud at work. The stupid guy, who does not even know what it is all about, stupidly opens his mouth and does not realize how lowly, intelligently, and dumbly he's spouting off. By the way, Bridget wrote this article about it.
Foreign drone over Hinterschmidruti.
On the afternoon of Monday, the 20th of March, 2023, I was in the center's kitchen, busy cooking dinner for the crew of the Hinterschmidruti. Suddenly, and like a flash of lightning, Billy darted across the kitchen to leave through the rear exit. After less than a minute, he came back in through this very door. It may have been around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At my questioning glance, Billy motioned me to follow him into the office, where he drew my attention to something on one of the surveillance monitors that explicitly showed the area between the house and Guido's trailer. He pointed out to me an object that was incessantly circling around above the construction site there, where Mark and Hartmut were present to give the path a bit more width. They did not see or hear the object, which was inaudible and invisible to the eyes. It must have been some kind of drone, which had the shape of a small but bright rectangular object, about 30 centimeters long and about 15 centimeters wide, bright yellow, without a propeller and completely silent, so quite different from the drones we know. That was why Billy had rushed to the scene to see what was happening there. The good thing was that although the object was very visible on the monitor, it was invisible and silent outside. After we had watched the spectacle for a while, we got Mark and Hartmut in front of the monitor so that they could also confirm the presence of the drone and what they had seen. For my part, I hurriedly fetched my mobile phone in the kitchen in order to shoot a film clip of this process on the screen. Unfortunately, however, the object disappeared the moment I switched on my mobile phone. Consequently, we could only see the dim shadow of the drone for a while. Then the episode was over. According to Billy, the drone was obviously not of terrestrial and especially not of Plejaran's origin, which Bermunda also confirmed later during a conversation with Billy. So once again, the object could only belong to a group of foreigners who were once again poking their noses into our affairs. Billy can observe such and similar occurrences on his surveillance monitors, which now make the center's surroundings visible everywhere for safety's sake, because he always has the monitors in front of him when he is sitting at his desk writing. In the same process, a tall male person also recently materialized outside his office window, dressed in a long gray cloak. Despite an immediate check outside, the being suddenly disappeared from the face of the earth, only to reappear in a different place. Of course, this human being was also invisible outside this time, although Billy ran outside almost at the same time to see what this suddenly materialized figure wanted. Here at Hinterschmidruti, many such or similar strange occurrences are the order of the day. Often one or more of us FIGU members witness them, even if unfortunately only rarely does anyone take the trouble to take up a pen to bear witness to what had unexpectedly come before their eyes. So there is no question of Billy making up such stories to make himself important or any such nonsense. Billy is integrity personified. Anyone who knows him would blush with shame to accuse him of fibbing. It is also to be said that UFOs have been seen or are being seen in Schmidruti or in the nearer and wider surroundings, but the observers are usually silent or keep quiet about it, so that only rarely does anyone contact us about it.
Bridget.
In order to give this stupid and impudent guy another stupid thing to complain about, I want to answer a question here, even though I am not particularly educated in the matters asked. The fact is that DNA and DNS are the same thing twice. So in German, the spiral-shaped thing is called DNA, which is called deoxyribonucleic acid, and the English spelled DNS means the same thing. Moreover, the DNA is the carrier of the hereditary information. The hereditary factors are called hereditary material or genome, whereby a gene is a section on the DNA that creates the ribonucleic acid, that is to say the RNA, which, based on information from the DNA, consists of a longer chain of nucleotides, and these in turn consist of an organic base, as well as a phosphate residue and a sugar molecule. This is what I can say because I am not an expert in this regard that I could give a more precise answer. The further question about the dear God, why the delusional believers are addicted to such a one. This delusional belief is nothing but sheer idiocy. For if the religionists and the philosophers of both sexes, etc., claim that a superintelligent, unknown creational force in the form of a god is the only good explanation of the origin of life and the intricacies of nature, then it can only be said that a human being who claims such a thing must be sick and completely stupid in the head. Where is this God supposed to have come from? How is he supposed to have come into being, and that he is supposed to have been eternal? This is answered so flimsily that the stupidity and idiocy of the answer shouts high to heaven. No God is the creator of heaven and earth, not the Almighty and not the Comforter, as he is also not the eternal, not the immovable, unchangeable, and not the ruler of the universe. There is also no indescribable, uncreated, and eternally dwelling one in heaven who observes his creatures, with whom human beings cannot make contact because he is supposedly too exalted, etc., but who is to be worshipped. In truth, the imaginary God is not a higher being that stands above nature, life, and the universe, for no living being is capable of this, not even the human being who, in his or her delusions of grandeur, believe that they can do this and destroys everything with their imbecilic thinking and actions. Those lunatics who claim such nonsense about an existing God should think about this. But since they cannot really think, but only indulge in illusory thinking, it is probably impossible for logic, reason, and rationality to break through and make the truth clear to them. How miserable a human being must be that he or she humbles themselves in such a manner and does not trust themselves, does not know how to direct their life well and correctly, does not determine everything connected with it himself or herself, takes it in hand and lives it. This, however, is to be discarded by the human being if he or she wants to live correctly, to lead and do everything himself or herself, so that they do not have to place an imaginary fantasized God above themselves and are not delusionally addicted to a faith, but is himself or herself. This also answers this question, if I can still answer the last one, that the different variations of earthlings are due to the fact that not all of them are of earthly origin, as are not peculiarities that arise in them. But that is another subject, which would lead much too far and into pre-astronautics, of which, however, we shall not speak. And it should also be said that I only answer questions of this kind once in a while, as I have just done, because my profession is teaching and writing, but nothing more. Besides, I constantly lack the time to be able to answer personal questions at all.
Which is certainly to be understood.
That is really the case, except when I talk internally with the FIGU members or with you. I also have other things to do with you, as I did with Svath, so I can also expose lies and frauds, such as the lie told by the Tages Anzeiger on 24.3. 2023 that the corona rampantly spreading disease epidemic in China was created by Martins and then spread worldwide. This is despite the fact that the rampantly spreading disease was created in China in laboratories through a secret deal between the Yank and Mao to take revenge because the fact that 3 laboratory accidents have occurred since then and that the disease has been released, mutated many times, and also spread to animals and livestock was not actually taken into account when the Yank and Mao vindictively made the pact. But everything is done to conceal the truth and to lift the biggest criminal state on earth, America, up into the sky. And this on the one hand, because it has already incorporated many states in its hegemonic mania, and on the other hand, because America's revenge with its NATO murder organization is feared, of which Ptah once said, as by the way did Quetzal and some others, that America is a second Nazi empire.
We do indeed judge it in that process, for the drive for hegemony, according to our observations and findings, has been driven with evil since ancient times. We have witnessed all the horrors of slavery, such as also how tens of thousands of human beings were robbed in Africa and traded and sold as slaves in America, murdered in their thousands, beaten to death, shot, drowned and dragged to death, strangled and massacred, and so on. We have followed how the indigenous people were persecuted, wars were waged against them, and they were tortured and murdered. And no state on earth, according to our findings, has waged so many wars and interfered militarily in foreign states' affairs with dastardly murder and war, secret service murder and crime, as well as with racial hatred, in such a way and somehow blindly as America. And the way America, with its military and so-called security forces and secret services, and in terms of all the intrigues and so forth, has been dedicated to its delusions of hegemony throughout the world since time immemorial, surpasses anything we know of in terms of evil.
The Swiss were also beneficiaries of slavery in America. And there were people who became rich from it, and then founded big companies in Switzerland, and had things built with which they created a monument for themselves with their blood money. It was also an idiotic Swiss person who caused hemp to be demonized as a drug in America and then worldwide, which has since caused many deaths, not through the hemp product hashish, but because of the smuggling and the associated death penalty. Hemp, from which bread was baked, as well as cords and ropes and fabrics, etc. were made, and which was also cultivated in large fields in my boyhood, where we played hide-and-seek. So Switzerland cannot exactly boast of being only good. Not even with its neutrality, which was broken because idiots and pseudo-Swiss in the federal parliament took over sanctions from the European dictatorship EU and applied them against Russia. And not to mention that other pseudo-Swiss are flirting with the EU and want to betray and sell out Switzerland to this dictatorship, as well as to NATO, not to mention that the entire Swiss people would then be bogged down. But not only the Swiss are in danger if they give up neutrality, which is in any case badly tarnished because of idiots in Bern, but it looks quite bad and nasty for the future for the whole of the Earth's population, namely with regard to artificial intelligence, because this will, as I have seen with Svath.
Surely that should be avoided.
Should, you are right, but the idiots of the Earthlings, who have their equally idiotic opinion and their megalomania of technical progress, do not know that an opinion is always wrong, because such an opinion only corresponds to a wrong view, which will eternally remain only such a view, and does not correspond to what reality and its truth is. The knuckleheads unfortunately do not understand that an opinion only corresponds to an unprovable assumption that can never be proven as reality. But the descendants and their offspring of these opinion acrobats and fanatical future developers, who are not only short-sighted in terms of logic, understanding and reason, but also stupid and dumb, will have to bear the consequences.
That will be so, for Svath described it in his notes as early as 1946. Also that you two together as Ptah informed us.
That's true, but Svath told me to think about it. I will stick to that, because pouring petrol on the fire of unreason would only make it flare up. Terror will also claim so many victims, which unfortunately cannot be avoided in the long run, because the Earthlings do not become more clever by being told the truth. They always want to be cleverer than this themselves, and if you pour them clear wine, they are so blinded in their megalomania that they smash the glass.
I do not understand. What does that mean? Pour clear wine and smash the glass?
That is an earthly expression for when the truth is told and it is not accepted.
Something like that, yes. We say that we give someone clear wine when we tell them what corresponds to the truth. For example, when we talk plainly, touchless, with someone, and just tell them the truth with hard words. But if he or she does not take them seriously or does not accept them, as Florena said, then he or she theoretically breaks the glass of truth.
Now I understand. But I have a lot to learn if I am to understand what you are saying. But what does that word you used otherwise, the tacheles, mean?
It means plain speaking, actually, saying without long palaver what is necessary, truth and purpose and aim, and without consideration. Mostly this is done by shouting, because the Earthling gets excited quickly when he or she speaks plainly and expresses openly and frankly what is to be said or shouted. Saying usually turns into shouting when the other party is not reasonable and simply refuses to accept the truth. That's why talking plainly often leads to quarrels and even murder and manslaughter. Talking plainly would be particularly important in politics, But although it is actually proclaimed in politics, people lie and cheat for all they are worth. This is then all the more so through the media, which very often only then engage in fraud, lies, and deceit, and lead the public around on a fool's rope. This means that you understand that the people or the readership of the media or listeners are being misled and deceived by false reports, etc. The expression comes from ancient times. The idiom originates from ancient times when, what is actually outdated, a human being was fooled with lies and deceit and made to believe falsely that what was lied about and deceived was correct and true. In ancient times, it was even depicted figuratively, in such a manner that some human beings pulled a rope behind them, the so-called fool's rope, and various vices were attached to it, which were considered foolish, lying, and deceitful.
So there is more to it than the words tacheles and fool's rope indicate.
That is so.
But we have to go again now, because we still have various things to do. Besides, I have the photographed,
Yes, I would be glad if you could get it to the gremium as soon as possible.
I will endeavor to do that. But now goodbye, dear father friend.
Then likewise, goodbye.
Take care together, and well then.
Article. A major of the German armed forces speaks out and was dismissed from the army and put into a psychiatric institution. Major Rhett. Florian Pfaff. Key witness on the Ukraine war. Tronstein demonstration and parade 28.1. 23 public speech in front of an audience.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind words and for the invitation. But thank you also to all of you who are standing here, because it makes no sense for one person to stand here and talk. It might only make sense if the whole thing is retold. And I will have to tell some pretty terrible things here. Unfortunately. Why am I standing here? Because of the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine, of course. And because I am against it. Because I am for peace. Not only against the war of aggression in Ukraine, but against all wars of aggression. And I will come to that. Why me? Quite simply because as a key witness for the real causes, I can tell you a few things. Also internal information from the Bundeswehr. What others would be forbidden to report. I am allowed to publish this because I am the person concerned. You know, we have censorship in Germany, even though the basic law says we don't have any. Censorship does not take place. It takes place every day, for example, in the way that employees are not allowed to say anything bad about their employers, because then they would be damaging them. This is true even in business. And since I'm the person concerned, I can tell you a few things. Then, because of the so-called turn of the times, I am here. I took the word right away because it is claimed that this is now something completely new. Now a great power, a nuclear power like Russia, would simply invade, illegally invade, such a small country as Ukraine. So that I am not misunderstood. It is true that Russia has started a war of aggression in Ukraine because the atrocities committed by the Ukrainians in the areas where the Russians live, that is to say, Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk, have nothing to do with the Russians. I say with Russia as a state. This is, so to speak, an internal affair of Ukraine. If it murders its own population, so does a boxer later, come to that. So Russia is not allowed to intervene, but it did. And there is the question, why is the war cry now as big as it has been since Goebbels' times? Why was the war cry not big before? Is it really a turning point? Did it really not exist before? The opposite is true. The initial situation was exactly the same 20 years ago, almost 20 years in the meantime. A nuclear power, in this case it was not the Russians, but the USA invaded an independent country that was not in any alliance, namely Iraq, and the development of history and the media treatment of it are now different. The development is quite simple. The USA did not only use the war in Ukraine to interfere, to incite the Europeans, also us, to supply weapons. The USA even brought about this war deliberately. That is something different. The Russians did not interfere directly in the Iraq War. Now, they may not believe that the USA wanted this war. I can't give a lecture here for an hour. If you want to, you can watch it on the internet. But I just want to take one point. This is what the Americans themselves are saying in Congress. These $66 billion that we have invested in the war in Ukraine, I say invested, he said, that is a good investment, because then the Ukrainians die and not us. If Russia is weakened and if Germany is separated from Russia. These are the two main goals, which, by the way, are not kept secret. You can accuse the Americans of being completely immoral, of having made many wars of aggression of this kind. After all, the Iraq War was not the first and not the last. But you cannot accuse them of not saying loud and clear that they want hegemony, that they want to maintain autocracy, that they are prepared to kill for it, that they are prepared to let people kill for it, and to spend $66 billion for it, including, if you can believe the reports, that Mrs. Newland is also very happy about the fact that the Iraq War was the first and not the last. The coup, if she did not help to bring it about herself. The media, our media, of course, do not mention the real reasons. This brings me to the next point, namely the main reason why Putin is now waging this war, or Russia. This is the Astana Treaty, which is systematically hushed up in our media. You can read everything in this treaty on the internet. It is also available in German. Translated, it says that everyone is free to choose their alliance, so Ukraine can also make any treaties with Fiji, but not treaties or not an alliance so that it conflicts with the interests of the other side. And that's what Putin predicted. If NATO expands to Crimea, then of course it won't go any closer. For all the talk, let's do it. So there is nothing in the Astana Treaty that contradicts the security interests of the others. And there you see again how our entire media world suppresses this. How even the scientific service of the German Bundestag claimed that it was only verbal. Baker and Genscher, they would have said it orally at the time. It can't be said orally anyway. And so on and so forth. Not true. It was also signed in writing in 2010. And of course, Russia cannot accept that the Black Sea Fleet disappears and that a NATO base is then built in Sevastopol for it. Moreover, after the treaty is terminated, and it wasn't the evil Russians who terminated the treaty, U.S. nuclear weapons could be placed on the border, as was planned for Cuba in 1962, which was then canceled. This brings me to my fourth point. Should Germany agree to NATO enlargement? Well, I have already said that it would be a breach of the Astana Treaty. Germany has signed, and thus Germany has also broken the Astana Treaty by saying, okay, we would agree to Ukraine being admitted to NATO after all. This is something that the Russians could not accept, even if they asked the head of the CIA today, who also wrote this in 2017. The Russians cannot put up with this. Then there will be war. But that was the goal. Then it is also a breach of the Minsk II Treaty. We know today that this treaty was meant seriously by the Russians. They thought it was about peace. They agreed to it. It was not that easy to reach an agreement. But the well-behaved West, the values West, of course, said, no, we're only pretending, that's not what we mean. We just want to buy time to prepare for war. This is also not puffery. You can read about it, Dr. Merkel has admitted it. And of course, this is also a breach of international law. The former four-star general Harold Kujat, who was after all the highest-ranking soldier in NATO, was the chairman of the military committee. He said quite clearly, yes, this is a breach of international law. By the way, he didn't answer the last question in his last interview in any German magazine or newspaper. He had to go to Switzerland so that he could say it so loudly now in these days. I don't want to extend this so far. Just very briefly, it is of course also a breach of the 2+4 treaty. If we now want a war against Russia because that's where we signed that we would never do that. And it is also a violation of the UN Charter, because one is only allowed to intervene in a war in the United Nations, if the Security Council gives a mandate, the same as in 2003, when the USA simply attacked Iraq even without a mandate. I had promised them before that I would tell them something from the Bundeswehr. But I can do that briefly because it is all on the internet, in a nice video also with Dr. Daniele Ganser. At the time of the Iraq War, I said that I would abide by the law, that I would not comply with your unlawful orders to participate indirectly in the Iraq War. I will not obey them, and it's just as good to say what the Bundeswehr did. First, they put me in a psychiatric ward because I actually had to know who might be in power. Then I had to explain to them that I knew who might be in power. But I didn't take the oath on the might of the USA and on the right for Germany. Then you sent the prosecutor and similar things more. And after the Federal Administrative Court rehabilitated me, what did the Bundeswehr do? You will also not find that so clearly in the press. They didn't just say, "We ordered you to break the law." Now we also have to state internally in written areas, password-protected areas, that we will not implement this ruling. We are still making a promotion, blocking these generals who do such things, who say, "Please, just please, they have to break the law now." They know that the Iraq War is a war of aggression. I don't call them generals. I call them publicly altogether criminals. And again, so that no undertone is missed here, I have said that those who know this is an attack knew it was a war of aggression. It was on television the day before the war started. When the war starts, it is a clear case of a war of aggression against international law. There may be generals who don't watch TV. I have also switched off. There may be generals who also don't go on the internet or listen to the radio, so the fact that they didn't know is excused. But whether there are very many of them, I don't know. So Russia and Ukraine are not NATO members, so it would be their business, and Germany has no right to intervene in this war, but the duty to ensure peaceful negotiations. That's what the UN Charter says. Thank you for agreeing with this because the media is asking us. But don't we also have to defend our democracy and freedom, like we did back then? Germany's freedom is also defended in the Hindu Kush. Well, that is quite simply the next war lie. Anyone who is even a little bit, but also only 5% clever about what Ukraine actually wants will say, even if it succeeds, what seems abstruse. But even if Ukraine succeeds in taking back these Russian territories militarily, then Ukraine's foreign ministry has already announced what will happen: deportation. Then the Russians will be treated in the same way as the Russians in the Donbass. And anyone who now says we have to liberate Crimea means at most the terrain. But don't think that any of these Russians think they are being liberated. This lie that we are fighting for democracy and freedom was not true even before the war. Ukraine was not a democracy then either, but was considered a hybrid regime. One place behind Myanmar in the democracy ranking. And to talk about freedom there, one would also have to talk about freedom and democracy in Myanmar. These are obvious war lies by either criminals or fools. It is hard to say what is the reason why they are still talking about democracy in Ukraine, where they know very well that there is no free press. There is no opposition party in Ukraine. The right to conscientious objection is suspended, even though it was signed. So to say that bloodshed is being prevented there is not even true because the Ukrainians themselves are dying. Even if you don't regard Russians as human beings and say that weapons should prevent bloodshed there. Good. If Russians are not human beings, then at least the Ukrainians will die. Russia won't put up with it. And I don't know, even if that weren't the case, whether it really makes sense to deport 1 million human beings of that size afterwards, to ban their language and culture. Is this the freedom the EU wants? Is that what Germany wants? No. Fifth point, can Ukraine have the territories back? Quite simply, it could have had them already. That has also been concealed in the media. We did hear about the negotiations in March, incidentally at Ukraine's suggestion, but they were not successful. Zelensky said, "I want the Russians to withdraw from all territories and the Ukrainians to be able to have the land." Because the Russians didn't say "Nyet," they said, "It's all the same." So in German, you can have your Ukraine, but the conditions, you are not allowed to join NATO. You have to remain neutral, and in return you get the assurance, security guarantees from the UN, from NATO, from other states. Ukraine would have wanted that, but Boris Johnson flew to Kiev on the 9th of April and prevented peace. These are the values of the West. His reasoning was, the West is not yet ready for peace. Of course, this is becoming more difficult every day because the West is obviously still not ready for peace. And Putin will of course not say, "I am ready to simply give up Crimea. You can now accept my surrender." That won't happen. He has too many supersonic missiles for that. I am at the last point. All these things I have reported, including that the Bundeswehr no longer abides by law and order. These are of course rejected by the population. The population wants the Bundeswehr to be bound by law and order, as the court demanded afterwards. The population wants such court rulings to be respected. The population already wanted what the defense minister said at the time. "I will shoot at the planes anyway." I'm not interested in the Constitutional Court. Did the people also want this minister to disappear? But we can't do that because the power is elsewhere. That's why we have to take back the might. That brings me to the last point. If we already have such dear friends who blow up the Nord Stream for us or announce in advance that they know how to cut the lines there, when we already see that the USA wants to achieve world hegemony in many such wars, that they even say that out loud. And when we see that the rest of the world, we're not talking about Europe and the USA, which together is about 5 or 10% of the rest of the world, that we don't want that. But multilateralism, something like democracy between nations, where one nation doesn't set the tone, where Germany doesn't become a leading nation and the French follow, but where we have one Europe and one world. World in which all states have equal rights. That is multilateralism. A stupid idea is a Chinese or Russian idea that you hear in our media, but even silence is forbidden. Do we remember how broken our democracy has been made by these wars and propaganda and by the agitation about them? People like me don't keep silent, but when someone keeps silent, we think of Munich, the conductor who said, "I am a musician, not a politician. I do not express myself." Then the thought police come and say, "But we know what you think, and that's why you're being dismissed for your thoughts now." That is no longer democracy. When what the people detest is done, including internet blocking, censorship, and incitement of the people. In Germany, after all, it was the Russians. Then this is a typical sign of dictatorship, as no one less than the President of the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution has said. And we have the consequences here in the supermarkets every day. We pay our industry, pay about 5 times what the U.S. industry pays for the same gas. This is exactly what the U.S. wants. Hurt Russia, separate Germany and Russia. Now I could conclude from this that I say, so we have to rethink and we have to see the Americans as enemies and the Russians as friends. No, my dear friends of peace, we do not have to see anyone in the world as enemies and not even the Russians as friends. It is enough if we try to live in peace and friendship, in peaceful coexistence with all the rest of the world. I am not asking for friendship. I am only asking for respect for the law. And the law also means that we are allowed to say, the USA murdered 1 million human beings in the Iraq War. Also as a nuclear power, also against a neutral state. That is at least as bad as what the Russians are doing. We don't want either. We must be allowed to say that. And demand an open public conversation with the USA, as was possible here now. I thank you very much for your attention, and we have now reflected, because we have enough time. Perhaps you still have questions. There was a video that unfortunately is no longer on the internet, but I recorded that so that anyone who wants that can have that from me. And as I said, it is now published on the internet on this Swiss TV station. There is a video there that gives the Russians an alibi because you know when these bodies were reported by the Ukrainians. And that was not when the Russians were still there, and also not one day after the withdrawal. There, the mayor, who is not a Russian but a Ukrainian, publicly announced, "Everything is fine, the Russians are gone, and everything is in wonderful order here now. Long live Ukraine, and you can't see a single corpse on the video either." There is a second video of the Ukrainian army driving through there, also without a single corpse. That means one day after the Russians left, there were no bodies there. But then, 4 days after the withdrawal, there are reports, for example from Der Spiegel, that everything is littered with corpses. Of course, the Russians believe that. Well, that is a fake, just like in the Yugoslavian war, when they said that the victims of Rakak were a massacre. But the bodies were only dumped. The Russians believed that and therefore said, "It's not true, it's all fake." And of course the television reported that it was the evil Russians who did it, and now they are also lying. The Russians were just mistaken. They couldn't believe that the Ukrainians were killing their own people. But that these people are actually dead is now proven. And you can also see from the white armbands that many wear. I saw a photo of someone with a white armband. Why the white armband? Was that neutrality? Obviously in Ukraine, the sign and neutrality are high treason. At least in the right sector, there are no Nazis. Of course, that is not official either because the Neospeak says yes, the ZDF has checked, there are no Nazis. Not true, of course. There is enough evidence or proof that there is also a right-wing sector there, even if it is not the entire government. But at least there is a Main Street Bandera prospect. There is a birthday of Bandera as a holiday. Look at the many monuments to Bandera that are in western Ukraine. So, of course, he is adored. And if you put one and one together and say that the corpses were not there before and they were there afterwards, and then it is also explainable that these corpses were only those who did not want to take part in the war, then you don't have to draw very many conclusions to say that it is more likely to be the Ukrainians. In court, an alibi counts. If someone is no longer there, then they cannot have done something. Watch the video, and who wants to watch more videos? There is also a nice one with Dr. Daniele Ganzer, where I prove these Bundeswehr things that I have just presented here. You only have to go to Dr. Daniele Ganzer, that is Daniele Ganzer, in one word. Full stop, H. That is not in Germany. Then at the top on videos and then scroll down a year or so and then you're at Major A. D on War of Aggression. There is also evidence there. And a third piece of evidence, before anyone asks, I have also pointed out that the U.S. says loud and clear that it wants to conquer the world, and not just cheaply, but right up to the most recent times, confirmed by professors like Seymour, or indeed others who have promoted this quite specifically. You can find this, for example, very nicely on the website https:/Darmstädter Signal. And there you simply go to the last seminar on the 105th seminar, and then you will find an audio case of Lieutenant Colonel Rhett. Jürgen Rose. You can listen to it there. I think it's very good that soldiers in particular are currently standing up for peace. It makes it credible that a soldier doesn't have to be a murderer, but that soldiers say we want to defend ourselves. And in this sense, it is not only Lieutenant Colonel Rhett, Jürgen Rose and myself, but also very, very high generals. I have already mentioned the youngest in NATO back then. The next one would be, he has to think about what exactly he is. He was the highest chief of staff of the Americans at that time. You can also find him on the internet, who now also says that it is completely irrelevant what weapons the Americans supply to the Ukrainians.
Kind regards, Johann, which opens on Tuesday under the American flag. Start of translation. Have they lost all fear?
Ahead of the Second Summit for Democracy organized by the USA, a correspondent of Rossiyskaya Gazeta spoke with the Secretary of the Russian Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev. Nikolai Platonovich, on Tuesday, the USA will convene its second Summit for Democracy, which the U.S. State Department says will lead to an acceleration of the so-called democratic renewal of the world. What do you think of this meeting of American vassals? Nikolai Patrushev. The Summit for Democracy, organized by the current White House administration, is certainly taking place within the framework of the U.S. presidential race, which has already begun. It will be another meeting in favor of a world order in which Washington wants to play the central role forever.
Dissenters, as expected, will be labeled as non-democratic states.
Once again, the U.S. will declare itself the defender of international law while insisting that the world must live by its rules. Geopolitical adversaries will be knowingly accused of false charges such as war crimes and corruption. But as usual, they will turn a blind eye to the actual genocides and financial frauds being committed with the approval of the White House. There will be promises to feed the hungry and free the wrongly convicted from prison. But not a word will be said about the fact that about 1/5 of all prisoners in the world, including those sentenced to multiple life terms, are in American prisons. They will be particularly eager to champion the rights of sexual minorities and to impose a green agenda on the world that will exacerbate the energy crisis in their satellite states. The U.S., which has proclaimed itself the world's leading dictator, will hypocritically speak of freedom of choice and in reality only mock countries where it tramples on sovereignty and the rule of the people. Washington wants to play the central role forever, while dissenters are to be labeled undemocratic states. Surely they will repeat that the U.S. is a model democracy for all humanity, and they don't want to hear any criticism of themselves. Nikolai Patrushev, of course. After all, the main task of the political regime in the USA today is to mislead its own people in the systemic crisis in which it finds itself. Democracy is only a facade for a government to disguise its disregard for the rights of ordinary Americans. Anyone who has carefully studied the legal and socio-political system of the U.S. has no illusions about freedom of speech and expression in this country. What freedom of speech can one speak of when even the former president of the U.S. is prevented from speaking out on social media and in the press on issues of public interest, and when the media are the mouthpieces of the largest corporations and elitist groups? While American politicians used words to defend the competition, they have made the country's economy dependent on corruption and lobby connections that reach all the way to the White House and the Capitol. The political process has become a clash of corporations that put their own people in key positions of might. They also determine foreign policy, strive for international domination, and create global hotbeds of tension for their billions in profits from various contracts whose alleged transparency they themselves control. While they proclaim democratic slogans everywhere, in reality, Washington has long been the world champion in terms of the number of wars and conflicts triggered, and in the brutal and illegal exploitation of the citizens of other countries. We would welcome it if the USA actually decided to move towards democracy and stop humiliating its vassal allies.
At the summit, we will also hear bombastic speeches about how Kiev, with the support of the good NATO, is confronting the universal evil represented by Russia.
Nikolai Patrushev.
I am sure that this will be one of the main topics. In fact, NATO countries are parties to the conflict. They have turned Ukraine into a big military camp. They supply weapons and ammunition to Ukrainian troops and provide them with intelligence, including through a satellite constellation and a considerable number of drones. NATO instructors and advisors train the Ukrainian military, and mercenaries fight as part of neo-Nazi battalions. They are trying to prolong the military confrontation as long as possible and make no secret of their main goal, to defeat Russia on the battlefield and further dismember it. In early March, a U.S. strategic bomber carried out a simulated nuclear strike against St. Petersburg from a distance of 200 kilometers.
This line of Washington is unchanged, after all. The American elites were never ready to come to terms with a strong and independent Russia?
Nikolai Patrushev.
That is correct. At least since 1945, the source of every escalation of tensions at the global level is the U.S. government's irrepressible desire to maintain its dominant role in the world. From their point of view, two great powers, Russia and China, prevent them from doing so. The Russian Federation not only pursues an independent policy of strengthening a multipolar world, but is in many ways intellectually and militarily superior to the U.S. China, on the other hand, is America's main economic competitor. After the attempts to suppress Russia, Washington is taking on China. Let me remind you that 75 years ago, in the famous U.S. National Security Council directive, Targets for Russia, concrete measures were adopted to destroy the USSR. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West was euphoric. However, this euphoria did not last long because Russia has come to terms with its mistakes. Today, our country can ensure not only internal stability, but also the security of its people from external threats.
At the beginning of March, a U.S. strategic bomber carried out a simulated nuclear strike against St. Petersburg from 200 kilometers away over the Baltic island of Gotland, deliberately provoking an escalation of tensions. Have they completely lost their fear?
Nikolai Patrushev.
For some reason, U.S. politicians, caught up in their own propaganda, remain convinced that in the event of a direct conflict with Russia, the U.S. is capable of launching a preemptive missile strike to which Russia can no longer respond. This is short-sighted stupidity, and it is very dangerous. Some people in the West are already talking about a revenge that will lead to a military victory over Russia, forgetting the lessons of history. To this we can only say one thing. Russia is patient and does not intimidate anyone with its military advantage. But it has modern, unique weapons capable of destroying any adversary, including the U.S., if its existence is threatened. However, the West is not only counting on military defeat, but also on Russia's economic emaciation, Nikolai Patrushev, obviously. Under Washington's pressure, many Western companies have left the Russian market. But they were badly mistaken when they counted on the collapse of our economy and the growth of protest sentiment. For a decade, the West has pursued the idea of creating a technological paradigm in which only it thrives, while the rest of the world is on the margins of social and economic development. That is why its politicians are furious about Russia's measured response to sanctions pressure. Our country angers the rulers in the USA and Europe with its economic independence, its independence of raw materials, and its scientific thinking. Western countries are themselves completely dependent on transnational corporations and global economic chains. If sanctions were imposed on England or France, for example, at the same level as on our country, these states would quickly descend into chaos. Russia, however, will not close its economy to the world. It will remain open and integrated with the economies of sovereign countries that are concerned about their own prosperity.
The undermining of the Russian economy and the emaciation of the Russian military are obviously two sides of the same strategy that the West has been trying for centuries.
Nikolai Patrushev.
Of course. One should not naively believe that the methods of economic aggression are gentler and more humane. For example, European countries and Japan have stopped supplying Russia with a number of medicines, including vital ones. In this respect, the Western pharmaceutical companies are consistently continuing the traditions of their predecessors. As is well known, most of these companies once collaborated in the development of Nazi Germany's poisonous gases. That is, they fully supported the ideology of genocide against the so-called superfluous peoples. Remember how the Anglo-Saxons sponsored the Nazis in the 1930s, hoping to steer them against the Soviet Union. Having reaped financial and geopolitical benefits from the Second World War, Washington and London are today again indulging in Nazism and fascism. They don't mind fomenting a pan-European or even global conflict with the help of Ukraine, and they think they can get away with it.
One gets the impression that the collective West has no intention in principle of learning lessons from the past.
Nikolai Patrushev.
The Western International has turned against our country more than once. Sometimes under the flags of the Poles and Swedes, sometimes with Napoleonic eagles, under the British flag or under Hitler's swastika. The result is the same. All attempts to crush Russia are in vain. Unwilling to learn lessons from this, the Western countries want to get their heads through the wall again. Washington is also unenthusiastic about the stability in Asia resulting from the Second World War and the liberation movements. The Indo-Pacific strategy of the USA is an attempt to create an Asian NATO. The new alliance will be another aggressive bloc aimed at China and Russia while pacifying the now independent states. The rearmament of the Australian Navy under the new AUKUS alliance, including the delivery of nuclear-powered submarines, and the military support of Taiwan and South Korea, have the long-term goal of establishing U.S. and NATO dominance over Eurasia on its eastern flank. Even during the Cold War, the Pentagon was ready to turn Europe into a radioactive desert at the slightest threat from the USSR. Washington has pushed Tokyo towards a new militarization. The Japanese self-defense forces are becoming a full-fledged army capable of offensive operations. This is already enshrined in Japanese law, in blatant violation of one of the most important outcomes of World War II. Prime Minister Kishida has stated that his country is buying 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles from the U.S. and relying on offensive weapons. Besides arming Japan, Washington is also trying to revive the spirit of Japanese militarism, which seemed to have been eradicated in 1945. One gets the impression that the inhabitants of the island state want to be turned back into kamikaze fighters who die for the interests of others. Westerners do not want to remember and are studiously silent about how their aggressiveness was used against the Soviet Union and China at the beginning of the 20th century, and that the Japanese eventually turned their weapons against the Americans, the British, and their allies.
American and European politicians today not only forget inconvenient facts from the past, but deliberately rewrite history, even disregarding common sense. This is evident in the hypocritical campaign to rehabilitate National Socialism. They have even made up that Europe was liberated from the Nazis by Ukrainians alone. They spread the myth of the Holodomor as an act of genocide.
Nikolai Patrushev.
Those who know history and do not try to falsify it know very well that in the 1920s and 1930s, access to food in the RSFSR was worse than in Ukraine. This is documented and there are many facts. One example is the biography of Grigory Boyarinov, a hero of the Soviet Union. His 100th birthday was celebrated at the end of last year. The well-known intelligence officer, who took part in the Great Patriotic War and a number of special operations, died during the storming of Amin's palace in Afghanistan. He was born in 1922 in the Smolensk region. His father was the chairman of a collective farm. In the 1930s, however, his family moved to Ukraine because it was easier to feed and survive there. By the way, today the Americans have adopted the famine slogans on a global scale and accuse our country of causing a global food crisis. I have no doubt that this issue will be debated at the Summit for Democracy. At the same time, Westerners themselves are blocking shipments of Russian grain and fertilizer abroad, while simply stealing Ukrainian supplies and selling them at 3 times the price to poorer countries, just as their ancestors did as colonizers.
Sometimes it seems that the West is digging a pit for itself by its actions. When you look at what is happening in the EU, You get the feeling that it has a very bleak future ahead of it.
The collapse of the EU is not far off. Of course, the Europeans will not tolerate this supranational superstructure, which not only has not justified itself, but is driving the old world into open conflict with our country. The USA is prepared to fight Russia not only to the last Ukrainian, but also to the last European. Even in the days of the Cold War, the Pentagon was ready to turn Europe into a radioactive desert at the slightest threat from the USSR. Little has changed in the minds of American strategists.
And how does this fit with the fact that the US and Europe call each other important allies?
The paradox is that Washington has a direct interest in the breakup of the EU in order to eliminate its economic rival and prevent Europe from prospering through cooperation with Russia. The Americans have already made great efforts to deprive the old world of its status as a powerful economic player. This is also why Washington has pushed the narrative of anti-Russia sanctions. The EU's economic model, based on a combination of cheap energy from Russia and advanced European technology, is undergoing a radical transformation before our eyes. Europe will be equally hard hit by the implementation of joint plans with Washington to reduce its dependence on Beijing for raw materials and technology. Moreover, the EU is in a migration impasse. Many of the migrants are not only unwilling to integrate into the European family, but are establishing their own caliphates and forcing local authorities and populations to live by their laws. With them also come representatives of criminal and militant groups to Europe. The perpetrators of the sensational terrorist attacks of recent years in London, Brussels, and Paris were EU citizens from national enclaves that already exist in Europe. Considering that Al-Qaeda, the IS, and other terrorist organizations were founded by the USA some time ago, and that the terrorists in Syria and Iraq are trained by CIA trainers, it is not impossible that the same persons are behind the preparation of terrorist acts in Europe. Their aim is to destabilize the situation on the continent, whose future is indifferent to the USA. The USA dominates Europe, ignoring the fact that the leading role on the continent has historically been assigned to Russia. In the 19th century, it was the Russian Empire. In the 20th century, it was the Soviet Union. So it will be in the 21st century.
Is the US convinced of its own solidity? Do they believe that everyone but themselves is threatened by disintegration? It seems to me that the USA can also be threatened by the danger of disintegration.
The USA has achieved the status of a great power through economic achievements based on cynical actions to appropriate territories and raw materials, to exploit peoples and to profit from the military misery of other countries. At the same time, they have remained a patchwork quilt that can easily come apart at the seams. Let's say they are divided as they used to be into North and South. At the same time, no one can rule out that the South is moving towards Mexico, whose land the Americans conquered in 1848. And that is more than 2 million square kilometers. Moreover, Latin American leaders make no secret of the fact that they are aware of the destructive role of the USA. The establishment of the Guantanamo Bay base is seen as a direct theft of Cuban sovereignty. And this is only one of many examples of the systematic encroachment on Latin American independence. There is no doubt that the southern neighbors of the USA will sooner or later reclaim the territories stolen from them.
Moreover, there are many internal contradictions in the USA. Even within the American elite, there is no unity.
Correct. The antagonism between Republicans and Democrats is getting stronger. Tensions are increasing between the various financial institutions and multinational corporations that care only about their own capitalization, not about America's well-being. The self-proclaimed untouchable elites of the USA have never felt connected to the American people. Projects like BLM, that is to say Black Lives Matter, and the indoctrination of transgender theories aim to mentally degrade an already apathetic population. The individualism and consumerism nurtured in Americans will play a cruel trick on their country. Ordinary citizens will not lift a finger to preserve the integrity of America because they know their government does not care about them. By not knowing what it is doing, the U.S. government is destroying itself step by step. America's problem is that it is too involved in geopolitical games, forgetting its own vital problems. While the U.S. invents new viruses in its military biology laboratories to destroy the human beings in undesirable countries, the once clean American cities are sinking into filth and rubbish. The American financial pyramid, built with the help of the printing press, is failing more and more. The model of uncontrolled issuance, where all economic problems are literally flooded with money, cannot work forever. With more than $31.5 trillion in foreign debt, the U.S. is increasingly heading for default. Declining confidence in the dollar, which is not backed by real goods, and the system of inflated stock market speculation will lead the U.S. into a severe financial crisis.
As pathetic as it may sound, the Russians not only don't want war, they don't want the U.S. or any other country to be destroyed.
Absolutely agreed. Our centuries-old culture is based on spirituality, compassion, and mercy. Russia is a historical defender of the sovereignty and statehood of all nations that have asked it for help. It has saved the U.S. itself at least twice, during the War of Independence and during the Civil War. But I believe that this time it is not appropriate to help the U.S. preserve its integrity.
End of translation. Interview Patrushev. The USA has an interest in the breakup of the EU. The Secretary of the Russian National Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, has once again given a long interview. Whether you agree with him or not, his geopolitical analyses are always very readable and well-founded. The 29th of March 2023, 6 o'clock HRS, Thomas Roper.
I have translated interviews with the Secretary of the Russian National Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, before because I think his view on geopolitics is well worth reading. Even for those who disagree with the Russian view, his comments are interesting because they show the arguments and views of the Russian government. And if you want to understand a conflict, you have to listen to both sides. That is why I have translated the new interview with Patrushev.
Translator. Thomas Roper, born in 1971, is an expert for Eastern Europe and has held executive and supervisory board positions in financial services companies in Eastern Europe and Russia. Today he lives in St. Petersburg, his adopted home. He has lived in Russia for over 15 years and speaks fluent Russian. The focal points of his media-critical work are the media, image of Russia in Germany, criticism of Western media reporting in general, and the topics of geopolitics and economics.